Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming back. Appreciate you guys coming out. I hope everybody had a wonderful holiday season. We started it off really nice with Alan gave us a great presentation on Alice's restaurant. We all had a fun time.
Yeah.
And I hope, let's see. Okay, let's see. I wrote this last Thursday, so I might have to, it probably hasn't aged well, but it's supposed to be upbeat. It's been a long, brutally cold winter. We finally got a couple good snowstorms. Up that a little bit. I think we're through the worst of it, no matter what the groundhog says. And it goes on like this. Spring is right around the corner. Any snow we get now won't last very long anyway. Okay, here's a good one. In just 17 days, the sun won't set until 6:40 p.m. So doesn't that sound wonderful? Okay, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I have a couple of announcements. The Society will be participating in the town's Celebration 250 event, and Alan will be organizing our part in it. We are planning on having a horseback rider arrive with a copy of the Declaration of Independence, just as they did 250 years ago, and we're looking to have 25 volunteers read short excerpts of the Declaration of Independence. Each reader will receive a small scroll with their part written on it. We'll be doing this Friday night, June 19th, at around 7:30 at the Veterans Memorial. If you're willing to volunteer in this, I call it a twice-in-a-life event, but I think this is going to be our last, so please see one of us, either Linda, Alan, Ace, or any one of us. We'll take your name and contact information. Okay, Linda, do you want to make the announcement about La Collaborativa?
So those of you who've been here before, at this time of year, the church, which I'm surprised, I thought they would be here tonight working on the Easter baskets, but they assemble Easter baskets and donate them to La Collaborativa. It's a nonprofit in Chelsea. And so we, I usually pass a basket around and see, collect some money to help them facilitate putting the baskets together. So if you feel generous tonight.
The topic of tonight's program is the history of enslavement in Massachusetts. Our speaker tonight is Vijay Joyce. Vijay is a prominent historian and historic preservationist. He played a recurring role as the architectural historian on the HGTV series Farmhouse Fixer, which unfortunately is not being picked up for next year. He worked alongside stars Jonathan Knight and Christina Creston to provide historical context for their renovation projects. Vijay also serves as the executive director of the Pickering House, nonprofit in Salem, which is the oldest home in the city. He is a project manager at Cummings Architecture and Interiors, a firm well known to us for his work on historic and traditional residences. He also operates Rekindled History, where he offers historical research and guide services to homeowners looking to understand the heritage of their properties. Vijay holds a degree from Boston Architectural College in both historic preservation and architectural history. Please welcome tonight's speaker, Vijay Joyce.
Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yeah, perfect. I don't know if I need the mic. I can project pretty well, but just regardless, we'll keep it here just in case. Thank you all so much for having me. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Linfield Historic Society. When you list out everything I do, I'm like, wow, that's a lot. Maybe I should go back a little bit. But very happy to come speak with you today on this topic, as I've been doing a lot of historical research. It sort of goes hand in hand when you work with old properties, old homes, old architecture. You learn about the people that built them, and of course what the buildings were used for. And there's a general idea of how we use a home, but of course that idea has very drastically changed over in nearly 400 years that at least New England's been around for. And of course, there's always things that get left out of the story, or things that in general just aren't touched upon, whether that's on purpose or in some cases just the accident of history, and that there is so much to cover. And really this topic of sort of the enslaved people of Massachusetts is, at least from my understanding, when I first started to dig into it, one of those things that's sort of flown under the radar for a long period of time. As growing up in New England, my history with enslaved people is really just been sort of like the North versus the South. There's, the North was always the place of abolition. This was the place of the Underground Railroad that would lead the freed enslaved people or the escaped enslaved people from the South up north. And so, in my mind, that was the entirety of it. It was sort of, okay, it was always sort of this bastion of freedom up here in the North, and the South had a lot of the enslaved population, especially around things like plantations and the large-scale plantation farming that they were involved in. But of course, going into architectural history, I come to find out that there's actually a lot of elements of buildings that really do reveal the sort of that darker underbelly of early New England history, which really is there to reveal that actually, yes, enslavement and the enslavement of others was very strong here. In fact, pretty much going back to the very, very beginning of New England, it almost immediately started. And so wanting to dig into that, wanting to come to understand it, has really been my sort of the goal with this talk here, and doing so in a way that ideally makes it succinct in such a way that helps us all to better appreciate this part of history that New England should not get a pass for. In fact, it is definitely very deeply intertwined with this early New England history. So, looking back at that idea of the North versus the South, the South historically has had a much greater history with enslavement than the North has had. But that, again, though, doesn't mean that the North gets a pass by any respects. There is no winner within this, and so this is not a comparison of what is better by any means. Every single case of enslavement, whether it is through African Americans or even the Native Americans here, it's absolutely horrifying, owning people or considering people as property. And Ron mentioned, and I am executive director of the Pickering Foundation and the Pickering House, and digging through the old probate records from the late 1600s, we come across many, many times instances of the enslaved people being listed very, very dead last amongst the whole list of what's been owned by the property. So it's even after animals like cattle and things like this. So wanted to dig more into that was sort of what really I wanted to do with this talk in a major way. So really, how did it all start is sort of the real big main question. What was the mechanism in place really that justified the act of enslaving a person, especially when we consider the question of how, in the context of the religious implications of starting New England. New England very deeply was tied in with religion. You can't really separate the two when we're talking about the 17th century. And it specifically has to do with the Puritans. The people that settled this land, they truly regarded themselves as God's holiest chosen people. That's not an overstatement by any means. They believed that they were creating a heaven on earth. In fact, the name Salem was changed from the Native American name Numkeg to Salem specifically for this purpose. Salem means peace, the term of Salem. It comes from the Bible itself, which is where they get most of their ways of life and as we'll see, even their laws. In Psalm 76, verse 2, it says that God has his tent in Salem and his home in Zion. So Salem was supposed to be the place in which God could live amongst his holiest of holy people, as the Puritans felt that they were. Now, when you're trying to establish a society here under this one way of life, this one rule, ideally this sort of very theocratic it's very much a theocracy. Religion rules everything back then. They they need to really work hard to prepare this land. And to draw a loan from the strictures of the people that were there. By that I mean the people that were amongst the like-minded Puritans that came along with them. You're not able to get as much labor as you would like or would need to use to really turn this land from a vast wilderness into sort of one that was that they were hoping to have this very settled, tame environment, like you might find over in Old England. They did have indentured servants, but those were generally hired on under a strict period of time. Usually 7 years was on average. You can get up to 14 years. But at the end of the day, once your term is up, if you will, you're set free. It's usually you're hired on under a set of terms that once you graduate from that indentured servitude, you'd be given some land or money or something of the sort. And so the people here, they needed more of a consistent source of labor, one that didn't require them to keep having to hire on people on a regular basis. And how then would they come to attach their mind to their religious mind? How do they attach their religious mind to this idea of slavery? It's not new to them. They were very well used to it. Slavery, of course, being over in Old England, and for the thousands of years that the Western world had existed before their time, slavery was always a part of their world. But how do these people, these very religious-minded people, do so? There's this incredible author and researcher named Lorenzo Johnson Green, who I pulled a lot of the research from. And in his book, that's called The Negro in Colonial New England, he writes very succinctly that slavery, they maintained, was established by the law of God in Israel, and regarding themselves as the elect of God, the Puritans, believing they're the holiest chosen people, New Englanders looked upon enslavement of the Indians and Negroes as a sacred privilege divine providence was pleased to grant his chosen people, as the Puritans felt that they were. And he goes on, "Were not Negroes and Indians infidels outside the pale of civil and spiritual rights, heathen people whose souls were doomed to eternal perdition? Were they not an accursed people whom it was quite proper to destroy or enslave?" And that was, in a nutshell, exactly how the Puritans would look upon sort of bridging this gap in their mind between something that I think we can all agree upon at a base level is a horrifying way to make a life. However, they were more than willing to dive into it. And not only was that sort of the stricture they had in their mind, the idea they had in their head, but there were active writings being written to try to promote that idea. I have an image over here of Cotton Mather. He would write in 1706 a pamphlet called The Negro Christianized, in which he would be writing out essentially all the reasons as to why this is moral and just. And I won't go into all of his details, but at the very end of this book, and you can actually find this online, if you just type this into Google, it's fully digitized in its original form. So you can read all the original words for yourselves. But at the end of it, there is a list of 10 commandments, specifically 10 commandments for the masters to ultimately teach their enslaved people as to why they should be fine within the lot in life that they find themselves. And I won't go through all 10, but for example, the 5th commandment, honor thy father and mother. The way that that's interpreted under this ideal is that, as Cotton Mather would write, I must show all due respect unto every one, and if I have a master or a mistress, I must be very dutiful to them. So essentially saying honor thy father and mother, he's saying honor thy master is effectively the equal within this commandment. There's also another one he calls out, the 10th commandment, which is thou shalt not covet. What's the meaning of that under Cotton Mather's mind? It's that I must be patient and content with such a condition as God has ordered for me. So it's this idea that they were already born under this mode of enslavement, and this was God's chosen right, and that was your lot in life. And so as a result, don't covet the position that other people have. This is the slot in life in which God ordered for you. And it's not just Africans that we're talking about here. It's also very, very, very popularly in the early years of the 17th century. It was the Native Americans. And how all of that was formalized, we have the religious ideal, but how that was formalized or codified, and really, well, the quote up at the top, they justified slavery upon the highest spiritual grounds. is really one of the ways, that's sort of the perfect way to describe it, actually gets placed into law in 1641. It's called the Body of Liberties. This is the very first legal code book that the English would write and place upon the people of this land. In it, it looks like they outlawed slavery, in which here, under the Body of Liberties, it says, "There shall never be any bond, slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, unless it be captives, lawful captives, taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us." So this is the law under which they would initially, and you can even see here as they invoked the word Christian and the God established in Israel, the law of God established in Israel, all of this being how they justify this idea of enslavement. So, like I said, it looks like they've pretty much made it illegal there. Well, pretty much immediately after, or even before this law was written, as these words were sort of being spread around the area, we get this very horrifying letter from a man named Emmanuel Downing. He was probably, he lived in Salem at the time. He was one of Salem's wealthiest people. His son, George Downing, is the, if you've all heard of Downing Street in London, it gets his name off of George Downing, the son of Emmanuel Downing here, out of Salem, Massachusetts. That incredible little connection as it occurs. But what Emmanuel Downing would write to his brother-in-law, John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts, the founder, of course, of this of this place, he says, "Sir, if upon a just war with the Narragansetts," invoking this idea that this just war could occur, "the Lord should deliver them," the Narragansetts, "into our hands, we might easily have men and women and children enough to exchange for Moors," what they called Africans back in the day. And he ends it by saying, "For I do not see how we can thrive until we get a stock of slaves sufficient to do all of our business." And so it was this idea around the proximity of the Native Americans and the fear that these Puritans had over them that would actually lead them to, enslave the first of them with the Pequot War that would occur between 1636 and 1638. The Pequot War would see the Pequot tribe of Native Americans pretty much entirely decimated. This was a massacre, the Pequot War was. You had some English settlers allying themselves with some native tribes, fighting against the Pequot people here. In the end, as he would write, as John Winthrop wrote in his history, over 700 people have been killed or taken into captivity. And the prisoners that they did attain, of which he writes here, "We sent 15 of the boys and 2 of the women to Bermuda by Mr. Pierce." Mr. Pierce was a ship captain of the time. He goes on to say, though, that Mr. Pierce misses Bermuda and would end up going to Providence. This is not Providence, Rhode Island. This is an island called Providence actually right off the coast of Nicaragua. It was an early Puritan settlement that they tried to strike up right off the coast over here. It never ultimately lasted all that long. It was pretty short-lived. However, it was out of Providence that Captain Pierce exchanged the enslaved native people for enslaved Africans in 1638. And then returned in February of that year. Mr. Pierce, in the Salem ship Desire, returned from the West Indies after 7 months. He had been at Providence and brought some cotton and tobacco and Negroes from thence. This is the very first record of the very first enslaved Africans that we have within the records of New England, 1638. Boston was founded in 1630. Salem was founded 1626. Plymouth, 1620. So this is pretty much immediately after this settlement gets started. They're looking to bring in this other population. And it seems as if we can actually trace some of the early inhabitants, or early enslaved people, as to where they went. Because we have from a diary entry of that same year of 1638, there's an explorer named John Josselyn. You can look up his book. It's called 2 Voyages to New England. He took one in 1638 and another in 1662. And on the first voyage, though, John Josselyn is visiting a man named Samuel Maverick. You probably are familiar with the term "to be a maverick." That comes from this person, not specifically Samuel Maverick, but his descendant, who was involved in the founding of Texas. But Samuel Maverick, one of the first colonists here in New England, even before Boston was founded, had a settlement on Noddle's Island over here. It might even be one of these properties that's sort of shown in the southern tip of Noddle's Island. John Jocelyn was staying with Samuel Maverick, and he writes in his diary that about 9 in the morning on the 2nd of October, Mr. Maverick's Negro woman came to my bedroom window, and in her own country sang a tune very loud and shrill. Going out to her, as he's describing, she used a great deal of respect towards me, and willingly would have expressed her grief in English, but I understood her by her behavior, and immediately after went to my host to learn of him the cause as to her crime. What he goes on to say is that she had been a queen in her own country, as he, John Jocelyn, observed a very humble and dutiful manner used toward her by another Negro who was her maid. So what's being said here is that effectively a queen was captured, likely maybe perhaps with some of her entourage, if nothing else, at least one of her maids, and sold into slavery here in Boston, and likely made its way to the house of Samuel Maverick. He goes on to say, asking his host Samuel Maverick why it was that this woman was crying. He says, Mr. Maverick was desirous to have a breed of Negroes, and therefore, seeing that she would not yield to persuasions, to lay with, a Negro young man that he had in his house, he commanded him, willed she, nilled she, by essentially saying whether she wanted to or not to go to bed with this man, which was no sooner done, but she kicked him out again, and this she took in high disdain of beyond her slavery, and this was the cause of her grief. So this was the way under which these people were treated in the early days, and that they were just seen as chattel. They were just seen as property. And just like a cow would mate with another cow and give a baby, that's how they believed or looked upon these Negro people here. Samuel Maverick did, at least certainly. And this is something that would be continued and in fact encouraged by the trade of early New England. It had everything to do with the fact that the early New England in this part of the coast was involved with the triangle trade. The triangle trade, of course, being as we have here, very simply put, it's a bit complex. There's a few double backings that happen with certain journeys, but this is effectively the triangle trade that gets created. From New England to the West Indies, what is now the Caribbean, right around here. They have provisions, they have fish, they have lumber, horses, onions, other articles of stuff. And then returning to New England from the West Indies, we get molasses. Molasses, which is the byproduct of the sugar plantations, which when you're making sugar, you're boiling sugar cane down, and the stuff at the bottom, the dark sticky stuff, that's the molasses. It's the byproduct, really. But then not letting anything go to waste, they take that molasses, bring it back up to New England, and they distill it into rum. As rum was one of the major sources of, not just income, but it was one of the major alcohol sources here. For those of you who are here that heard my talk last year around the history of drinking in colonial New England, you'll understand how prevalent rum was within the daily lives of people back then. But that rum would then get distributed, not just back to the West Indies, would also go over to Europe, but a huge amount of it would go over to West Africa, where in return it was exchanged for gold dust and enslaved people. Those enslaved people would then go back to the West Indies to be exchanged for molasses, as the West Indies being a horrifying existence for anyone working on these sugar plantations. They needed a steady supply of enslaved people because of the high mortality rate that these plantations and sugar plantations would cause. Some of those enslaved people most of them would stay here, but some of them would also go back up to New England to be sold into the houses here of the local people. And this is the main trade that would carry out pretty much all of New England through from the 17th century, arguably even beyond the Revolution, but up to the Revolution if we're talking within when it was most prevalent. So the importation is just as I described, but then of course you also have some enterprising people with ill intent. As in 1645, we had a couple men from Boston, one named William Smith, another is Thomas Keyser. They were looking to circumvent the monopoly that the Dutch had on the trade of enslaved people. The Dutch at this time were mainly the ones that had a monopoly, granted by England. A lot of them had the monopoly on supplying slaves from Africa. Well, William Smith and Thomas Keyser wanted to circumvent that. And so on a Sunday in 1645, joining London slave raiders, they attacked an African village, killing about 100 people and wounding others. They captured 2 enslaved people, brought them back, and sold them into slavery in New England. Word got out, though, how these 2 enslaved people were captured, and they were arrested by the government, and a committee was appointed to press charges. Not for the reason you think, though. As the 1641 Body of Liberties and one of the capital offenses, so the offenses that would ultimately be deemed to be punishable by death, there is a law against man-stealing. And what the general court record in describing the punishment or their reaction to this news of man-stealing is that they say they bear witness against the heinous and crying sin of man-stealing. And they also prescribe such a timely redress for what is past, and such a law for the future that may sufficiently deter all others from doing this act. What they're complaining, though, is not the fact that these people were enslaved. They were complaining about how these enslaved people were attained. They didn't care how they were originally obtained. All they cared about is how they, the New England, Massachusetts people and those under their rule, how those people attained enslaved people. And in that case, it needed to be in exchange for something. It could not just be a raiding party goes out and captures anyone that they would like to see. So this is as well where it on its face seems like this would be a good thing, that the government is trying to punish those people who had enslaved others. The reality is they're just calling out the crime of stealing someone, regardless of how that occurred. And so this is where, again, I bring up the capital law of there cannot be any bond, slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, or willingly sell themselves, or are sold to us. The idea of which they've gone over to Africa and captured people on a raid doesn't meet any of these criteria, so as a result, that was seen as illegal. Of course, these enslaved people weren't sent back to Africa. They were just they were like, well, they're here already, so they're just going to be sold off and left to continue. We see that a lot within the early New England records around enslaved people. Once they're here, their people are kind of like, well, they're here, so we're just going to continue on with their duties. We hear in 1687 the prevalence of this within the region. It comes to us from an outsider in that there is a report of a French Protestant refugee in Boston who would write in 1687, "You may also own Negroes and Negresses, as there is not a house in Boston, however small its means, that has not 1 or 2. There are those that have 5 or 6, and all make a good living." Not the enslaved people make a good living, the people that own them do. As this French Protestant refugee is describing the vocation and the quality of the people living in Boston, and in this case just happen to be describing how many of the enslaved people they have. He also goes on to say that there is no danger that they will leave you, the enslaved people will leave you. For the moment one is missing from town, you only have to notify the savages, the natives, and ultimately they rarely quit you anyway, for they know not where to go, there being few trodden roads, and those which are trodden lead to English towns or villages, which on your writing them will immediately send back your men. So this was in also some ways telling people back in New England, how they could easily strike it out here with this enslaved help. It wasn't low, though, like everyone was on board with this by any means. And one of the very first anti-slavery tracts we get out of Massachusetts comes from this man, Samuel Sewall, who would write in 1700 this anti-slavery tract called The Selling of Joseph. It started when Samuel Sewall heard about an enslaved African named Adam, who was enslaved by a prominent Boston merchant named John Saffin. who hired out Adam. So interestingly, there was almost like this agreed upon arrangement instead of being bought as an enslaved person and enslaved for life. Safin had hired out Adam for a term of 7 years and promised Adam's freedom upon that term being up. However, Safin would end up denying Adam his freedom, leading to several years of legal proceedings, which is when Samuel Sewall heard about it, and he wrote this tract called The Selling of Joseph. And he takes pretty great offense at the terminology of the law that gets written, the law that I mentioned before about there's no bond slavery amongst us, specifically for the reasoning that it can only be taken, or captives taken in just wars, in which he writes within this Selling of Joseph, every war is upon one side unjust. An unlawful war can't make lawful captives. And by receiving them, we are in danger to promote and partake in their barbarous cruelties. I am sure, as he writes, if some gentleman were to go down to the Brewster Islands in Boston Harbor, to take the air and fish, and a stronger party from Hull, that town Hull, Massachusetts, which should surprise them and sell them for slaves to a ship outward bound, they would think themselves unjustly dealt with, both by the seller and the buyers. And yet, 'tis to be feared, we have no other title to our Negroes. So that's what he's describing here, ultimately saying that this law that you've written, captives taken in just wars, every war is unjust to one side. So where does that come from? What's the point of that? And that's essentially what Emmanuel Downing would write earlier about if a just war were to happen with the Narragansetts, we could take them because then we would have a stock of slaves sufficient to do all our business. And it was a big business. In fact, we get in 1704, in the newsletter, or the newspaper at the time, the Boston Newsletter, the very first ad for an enslaved person to be sold. So like in the classifieds back in the day, and you can go, there's called the Adverts 250 Project. That date's probably a bit old now, it might be 260 or something now, but if you go to Adverts 250 Project, I mean, every single day they will post a clip from an old newspaper that shows either someone putting in the paper a call to capture one of their runaway slave people or the sale of enslaved people itself. So, here we go. Here's a longer one here describing a Negro boy named Jack who was taken a slave from the Portuguese by the pirate and brought into this port, among other things. And so this is where this, if you look in the old newspapers, next to the sale of houses, next to the sale of property, you're going to find, right mixed amongst them all, the sale of enslaved people. And this was in fact encouraged by the government in many ways, specifically coming around in 1713, when we get what's called the asiento, or the contract, in which we have a contract between Britain and Spain, in which Britain is contracted by Spain to transport and supply 4,800 Africans per year for 30 years, and to fulfill the contract for the Spanish colonies in South America. And because this is a contract between Spain and Britain, New England, this is a British colony, the merchants here within New England were also expected to be part of holding up that deal. 144,000 males were specifically called out, and they refer to them as piezas de India, which is pieces of the Indies, and that was the Spanish equivalent of one person, really. That's how the equivalent of horsepower specifically is how the Spanish considered them. So pieces of the Indies is how the Africans were looked upon. We also have the orders from Britain to Massachusetts, in which they are ordering the colony of Massachusetts not to tax or discourage the importing or exporting of enslaved Africans. So trying to do anything they possibly can to try to encourage this trade and prevent any taxation from placing upon it, and of course then potentially reducing the ability for this contract to be made, and then of course the wealth to be made off of it. We have as well, this is where we have in the Acts of Resolves of the province of Massachusetts Bay in 1707. We actually have almost exactly the valuation, if you will, of what an enslaved person would cost. They put it in the Acts and Resolves of Massachusetts Bay, placed the enslaved within the same category as personal estate, just above cattle. They set the price for the enslaved people as well. Each male Negro above 14 years of age is 20 pounds value. That's about $4,500 today. Each female Negro of 14 years of age and upwards is about 15 pounds value, which is about $3,300 in today's money. And so they're regulating the cost in many ways of these people, which is probably one of the more horrifying things. If it weren't as well for how these people were brought here, which is that on the Middle Passage you might be probably have heard that of before, the conditions were recorded in 1828 by a man named Robert Walsh, in which he had captured a slaving ship, and in investigating it, went down into the hold. He would make this sketch subsequently of it. You have the cargo hold right here, you've got more cargo cannons on either end, and then in this little space right below deck, 3 feet 3 inches high, are these Africans that are just stacked up together. And he describes it as, the circumstance which struck us most forcibly was how it was possible for such a number of human beings to exist, packed up and wedged together as tight as they could cram, in low cells, 3 feet 3 high, the greater part of which, except that immediately under the grated hatchways, was shut out from light or air. And when the thermometer, exposed to the open sky, was, standing in the shade on our deck, 89 degrees. 89 degrees outside, within this 3 foot 3 square, crammed in together, without any light, without any ventilation, is ultimately is what he's describing here. While expressing my horror at what I saw, he continues, and exclaiming against the state of this vessel for conveying human beings, I was informed by my friends who had passed so long a time on the coast of Africa and had visited so many ships that this was one of the best they had seen. He also will say, and what I have over here in the corner, is that they were all branded like sheep, with the owner's marks of different forms. These were impressed under their breasts or on their arms, and, as the mate informed me, with perfect indifference. So treated just like cattle. Here in Massachusetts, and even throughout New England, we even have left upon the landscape, whether it's by name or by architecture, evidence of a lot of these prominent people and their slave holdings. Jonathan Belcher, to start off with, Belchertown, Massachusetts is named after him. He was a prosperous merchant out of Boston. In 1730, he became the governor of Massachusetts. In 1728, he and 4 other merchants sent a ship to Guinea. There, he had ordered his captain, Captain Atkinson, to exchange the cargo for, quote, good likely Negroes from 12 to 25 years of age, the greatest part to be boys. Peter Faneuil, probably heard the name because of Faneuil Hall. Peter Faneuil's uncle Andrew was one of the wealthiest men in Boston at the time of his death, leaving Peter with a massive fortune. In 1718, Peter advertised that he was selling Negroes at his home. And his gift, Peter Faneuil's gift of Faneuil Hall to Boston, was evidence of the great wealth that was made possible that he gleaned from the slave trade. Isaac Royal, the Royal House in Medford, Massachusetts, has one of the only remaining what they call extant, so separate from the main structure itself. It's its own separate thing. It's the only, or one of the very few extant slave quarters in Massachusetts. So if you're down south in one of the plantations in the south, you might have seen pictures of, you might have seen if you visited yourself, the slave quarters that would exist on the property. We don't see a lot of that up here because of the population of enslaved was relatively small. They were generally living within the home of the family themselves. However, Isaac Royal Jr., being so wealthy as he was had enough enslaved people under his ownership that he actually built a separate quarters for them. And this is still, you can still see this today at the Isaac Royal House in Medford, Massachusetts. It's actually, I believe, they're turning it into an exhibit space now that they've realized exactly what it is, but before that it was their offices, if I'm not mistaken. Then you have Samuel Waldo. Waldo County in Maine is named after him. He was a wealthy merchant, land speculator, and distiller, and his ship Africa would be one of those that purchased a large quantity of Africans, specifically 200 of them. I mentioned returning to the slave quarters of Isaac Royal. We also have out of Marblehead what has been recently discovered as likely the second extant slave quarters known in New England, right next to the Jeremiah Lee Mansion. The massive mansion such as this was not able to be had, the property and the wealth was not able to be had without having enslaved people help build it for you, especially at this time and age in the 1700s. And so they're actually turning this into an exhibit space currently, and I believe it might even be finished already, but specifically as a way to help tell this story. As most of these buildings that did hold enslaved people, they're not going to be built in any grand manner like you would, say, the Lee Mansion. It's literally just going to be as simple of a structure as you can because it's housing your property. That's really all it is. It also shows the lack of respect that's shown for the enslaved people themselves. But in a way, what was life like for an enslaved person here? Well, I mentioned earlier the religious nature of it, and so because of that, New Englanders considered slaves to be divinely committed to their stewardship, and so that was the relationship they had. They were treated better than they were down south. This is not a comparison to say that one is better than another by any means. They ate the same food as their owner's family did. They sometimes even sat with the family themselves at the dinner table. They slept under the same roof as the family more often than not. Except in the instances of these massive mansions like the Royal House, or in this case, the Jeremiah Lee Mansion. They slept under the same roof, but generally they had their own quarters, either in the basement or the attic. Very rarely, but some instances were recorded that they slept on the same floor as their owners as well. Maybe they even had their own bedroom to some extent. They were educated. The Puritan society would dictate so. In Puritan society, everyone was educated regardless of who you were, men, women, children, enslaved people even. They were also usually taught a trade. And this is one of the things that led the population of New England enslaved people to be smaller than those of down south. In that down south, they're dealing with massive plantations that are acres and acres and acres large. Here in New England, you're not really having that large acreage. You, in fact, usually have your trade that you're practicing, and you would have maybe one or two enslaved people to practice that trade with you, which means you're educating them in such a way. You might also have a few household enslaved, but generally it's about one or two per family on average. There were curfews that were established for enslaved people. They weren't allowed to be out past 9 p.m. or they would be jailed and publicly whipped. The severity of punishment, though, wasn't as great as that in the South, or even especially the West Indies sugar plantations, but it was a capital offense to willingly kill your enslaved person. However, there are instances of the owners killing their enslaved people, and though in practice, in the courts punishing them, but in practice, the courts never actually brought up the death penalty for that. So, you can have a law in the books, but it entirely depends upon if you're willing to enforce that to make it real. To give you a sense of context as well, on the eve of the Revolution, about 1 in 50 persons were African within New England. Compare that to 2 out of every 3 people versus down south. So speaking of the Revolution, there's this sort of kind of cognitive dissonance we might have when we're learning more about this period of time. So you have, of course, Britain is tightening its grip upon its New England colonies here. You have the British revenues raising taxes. This is where you get a lot of the intolerable acts, the tax raising, like the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act, the Townsend Acts, for example, of course. And this is when we start to see the colonists here, the New England revolutionaries, using this condition and comparing this condition placed upon them of taxes to be almost equal to tributary slaves. As Samuel Adams says here, if taxes are laid upon us in any shape without our having a legal representation where they are laid, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves? So you start to see this language coming around from the people that are fighting for revolution, claiming they do not want to be slaves to Britain, and yet they themselves are also holding people in enslavement here. So one of those things in which they, in large part, just didn't consider this or weren't willing to think deeply about it. Although that isn't the case for everyone. You do start to see people needling them, saying, why isn't it you're considering this for the people that you have under your own enslavement? And in fact, in reaction to some of these acts, specifically it was the Sugar Act of 1764, the official statement that came out of the Massachusetts Trade and Fisheries goes that the destruction of the fishery, which is what they're claiming would happen if this tax were to befall them, the destruction of this fishery will not only lessen the importation of goods from Great Britain, but must greatly prejudice the whole trade of the province, as the trade to foreign islands has become very considerable. They go on to describe kind of what I described within the West Indies trade. You have the provisions, the fish, the lumber, the horses, and the onions, amongst other articles as he describes, exported to the northern colonies, for which we receive molasses in return. This is distilled into rum for the fishery, and to export to the southern colonies for naval stores, which we send to Great Britain for grain, and to Africa to purchase slaves for our own islands in the West Indies, and likewise to supply the fishery at Newfoundland. They end it by saying, this has been a very considerable branch of business which we cannot do without. There was some recourse for enslaved people, which is that they were allowed to sue for their freedom. You got to imagine not a lot of these would ever come up based upon the fact that you'd had to have the means to do so. They were allowed to sue for their freedom. Usually it was almost entirely on the basis of a contractual agreement, similar in the sense of the selling of Joseph and how Samuel Sewall wrote that tract about Adam and John Saffin there. And they later on, though, in reaction to the language coming out from the revolutionaries on the basis of a natural right to freedom, that's what we start to see. If you notice the dates of these petitions, these are all petitions from enslaved people to the governor at the time, using the language of the revolutionaries to claim their own freedom for themselves. I won't read them all, but I'll read a little one here, in which it says, the petition of a great number of blacks of this province, who by divine permission are held in a state of slavery within the bowels of a free and Christian country, humbly showing that your petitioners apprehend that we have in common with all other men a natural right to our freedoms, without being deprived of them by our fellow men, as we are a free-born people, and have never forfeited this blessing by any compact or agreement whatever. So, while ultimately you would be able to sue upon those terms, you could only sue if that language existed on a document that was ruling over you. We might think that that would come from the Declaration of Independence, where the beginning of it all is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. While those words carry the weight that would be needed to free an enslaved person who sued for their freedom, the Declaration of Independence is not a legal document. It's a declaration. It's a declaration of intent. There's nothing actually hard and fast about that, about those words. It's literally just a notice of saying, this is what we plan to do. So because of that, the enslaved people were not able to sue for their freedom based upon this idea. However, what the Declaration would trigger is the need for each of the states that were going to come under this, come under the title of the United States of America. It gave each state a duty to fulfill to create their own constitutions, their own documents that would dictate how the people within that state are to live. We ultimately have John Adams, who would write the Constitution for Massachusetts, and he tried to make sure initially that each state constitution be drafted and ratified by special conventions that represent the consent of the people. So usually made up of representatives as well, chosen by the people. And when it came to time for Massachusetts to write its own constitution, they did it initially without any public comment. They did it entirely by the legislature. They ignored John Adams' recommendation, and in 1778, Massachusetts got what was to be its first constitution. They put forth an initial draft, but it was resoundingly rejected by the people here. 2,000 voted for it, 10,000 voted against it, largely due to a pamphlet that was put around by people from the Essex from Essex County. It contained no list of individual rights within the Massachusetts Constitution initially, not the one I'm pointing to here that I have up on the screen, but the first version that came out. It had no Bill of Rights. It in fact even barred free black people from voting, and it even legalized slavery. The initial push in the Massachusetts Constitution was to legalize slavery within its own document. Of course, though, this was resoundingly rejected. John Adams would come in and write the second one. He writes it in 2 months. And his version includes a Declaration of Rights in the very first article of the Constitution. Literally the first words of the Constitution are, all men are born free and equal, and have a certain natural and essential and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. And that is ultimately what is needed to bring forth the very first successful anti-slavery suit, which comes about in 1781 in Sheffield, Massachusetts, way western Massachusetts, pretty much the border of New York. A woman who was born Mumbet was enslaved by a man named Colonel John Ashley in this house. The Colonel Ashley house is a place you can still go and visit. She heard this new Constitution being read aloud in Sheffield, Massachusetts, as of course, just like the Declaration of Independence, gets sent around by riders everywhere around this country, or the early country as it was, and being read aloud and extolled its virtues, so was the Massachusetts Constitution. And so she heard these words, that initial preamble, the Article 1 that John Adams wrote about everyone having the all men are born free and equal. And after a violent incident with Ashley, her owner there, Mumbet's owner, she left the house and contacted a local lawyer named Theodore Sedgwick. And she then sued for her freedom using the Declaration of Rights from the new Massachusetts Constitution. And she won. She shortly after would change her name to Elizabeth Freeman. That wasn't though the end of it, because we then get the final blow to Massachusetts, to slavery within Massachusetts, with what's known as the Quock Walker cases. It was a series of 3 cases brought by a man named Quock Walker, who was a then enslaved person, who sued for his freedom on the promise of his owner. His owner had promised him his freedom upon his death. However, the owner reneged on the promise, or at least his sons did, and Quock Walker then sued for his freedom as he was promised. After a series of appeals, having lost some initial cases, they appealed. It ultimately went up to the state Supreme Court. And the lawyer for Walker's side argued for the freedoms that were enshrined to all as codified within the Massachusetts Constitution. And Chief Justice William Cushing would announce, "The sentiments that are favorable to the natural rights of mankind led the framers of our Constitution of Government to declare that all men are born free and equal, and that every subject is entitled to liberty, and to have it guarded by the laws as well as his life and property. In short, slavery is, in my judgment, as effectively abolished as it can be by the granting of rights and privileges wholly incompatible and repugnant to its existence. The court are therefore fully of the opinion that perpetual servitude can no longer be tolerated in our government, and that liberty can only be forfeited by some criminal conduct or relinquished by personal consent or contract." That right there was the final blow to legalized slavery within Massachusetts. However, it wasn't sweeping and it wasn't instantaneous. This is not like in today's age where we have cell phones and news alerts that immediately pop up every instance. You have to have the knowledge. You hopefully maybe can hear about it from a newspaper. If someone's reading it within your house, maybe you get the news that way. News travels slow back then in the 18th century. And so while it did not immediately come to a sweeping end within the state, the legal determination meant that any time a new suit of freedom came forth, it was pretty much immediately granted. And as a result, slavery was heavily, heavily reduced within the state to be almost wholly abolished once the revolution came and ended.
And Rajiv, this is in 1781?
83 in this case, yes.
Yeah, 1781. Good.
Good indeed, yes.
In French, c'est bon.
But of course, you know, this is while it is the end of the talk here, it is not the end of the story by any means. There is still a long way to go when it came to the equal rights of not just in Africans, but Native Americans, some things that we are still dealing with the effects of today, especially when we consider how our prison systems are run and how modern slavery, maybe not in that name, has applied itself to many of the workings of our modern age today. So thank you all so much for that.
Thank you.
Kept it to an hour, which left out a decent bit, but I do, because of that, I wanted to provide a lot of my sources, pretty much most of the sources I have here. We are incredibly lucky to have what we have when it comes to the history, not just of enslavement, but the history in general within Massachusetts and New England. This one, The Negro and Colonial New England by Lorenzo Johnson Green, is one of the greatest academic sources you could ever find on this. If you really want to get into the numbers, into the actual the real nitty gritty of it all, good and bad, all of it, mostly bad, that's the one that does a great job with it.
Okay, great. Is this working? Okay, does anybody have any questions we'd like to ask?
Where that last case that you documented was 1783,
Correct, yep.
and the abolitionist movement really was stoked up in the 1840s, 1830s. What happened in between?
So what really triggered it was a lot of the, in the early 1800s, you start to see a lot of newspapers start to come out, and the flow of information starts to get greater and greater and greater. So a lot of the stories of the enslaved in the South start to come up here in great way, in large waves. And so as a result, you have a lot of anti-slavery organizations starting up around that time. That doesn't mean that they weren't there before, they just weren't there in the way that we know of them, you know, by the 1830s, 40s, 50s. Yeah,
Thank you.
of course. Yes?
Were there any families in Linfield who held slaves?
I tried to track that down. I wasn't able to find by name anyone. No doubt there were. If you have any estate, I mean, we're in Linfield, right? So this is the farming community, and there's no doubt that there were, large families here of prominence that owned enslaved people to help work that land. The way you'd be able to find that out is going into probate records and doing a deep dive into that. Whenever they make an account of the estate, they will list out, they'll actually go sometimes literally room by room in a house and say, this is what's in it. And in the barn, which is usually the last thing listed, with all the property and whatnot, is usually when they'll list out the enslaved people. Yes?
I understand that some of the slaves, when they were freed, they had no place to go, no jobs,
Right.
houses, so they stayed.
Yes.
Many of them stayed with the families that they had been with,
Yes.
and so the new law that require that those people now be paid for their labor.
If not paid actively, paid under an agreement like, after a certain term, we'll let you go and you get this amount of land or this money, or when we pass away, you're not, they're already freed, so it's more about that they're given something instead of just sort of like, all right, you're off on your own. They are compensated in some form, whether it's active payment or at the end of the term under which they go to their owner to have them hired on for a certain amount of time. This is also where we start to see a lot of domestic servants come up. So we start to see that sort of transitioning into the Victorian age, where we start to have a lot of servants in the home. They're just given a salary or provided more than what was done previously. Yeah. Yes.
So first of all, I was horrified to learn a lot of this information.
Me too.
As an educator myself. But I'm curious, what led you down this path of research?
So there is a house in Ipswich. Well, there's many houses in Ipswich, of course, but there's two instances. So there's a house in Ipswich called the White Horse Tavern. It used to be the White Horse Tavern on High Street. I was measuring this house up to do some work within it, and up in the attic, in normal attics, it's just a big open storage space. You just open framing everything. Up in this attic, though, there was a door that led into a room that had the chimney running through it, but otherwise nothing else. And so I thought that was a little weird, because why would you have a room that had a door to it up in an attic space? That's relatively rare when it comes to the 17th century especially. And I dug into the probate records of this White Horse Tavern, and it turns out that actually they had enslaved people within their home. Also in Ipswich, there's a home that has a, this is not so much that they held enslaved people, but there's a home that in the back, there's a floorboard that you open up, and there's stairs that go down, and these stairs go to a tunnel that then you take a turn in the tunnel and you go out, and it breaks through the foundation of the house and goes down to the river, and that's where in fact that they would tunnel people through for the Underground Railroad there. But that White Horse Tavern was the initial one where up in the attic spaces you'd see all these, like these rooms that in the 17th century, if you were making a room for yourself that you, or for a room for someone that you respected or was part of your family, you put a fireplace in there, because of course that's how you heat something. But in this case, there was none of that. It was just this rough, rustic room. And that's actually, if that didn't exist, I might not have gone down this path, because it's those tiny little remnants that really start to reveal. And I'd always known about the royal slave quarters, the Isaac Royal House, but I just thought that was some sort of like a one-off type thing, at least in my naive mind initially. And the more I dug into it, I realized that that's a great, not in a positive sense, but a large example of it. And in fact, it was more common than not, more places around.
Thank you for enlightening us.
Of course, thank you, my pleasure. Well, maybe not exactly pleasure, but I'm glad to help teach people about this.
You mentioned the Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
I was always told as a kid that there was a certain symbol or sign with chimneys that were white and had a black band. Is there any truth to that? Combining your knowledge set here, perfect guy to ask.
It's not. No,
Okay.
that's a myth.
Okay.
For a couple of I've also heard it around the idea that you would paint your chimneys white if you were on the side of the king, like if you were if you're a loyalist in that way. Why you would want to call yourself out in either instance, right, is sort of, that's kind of counterintuitive. They painted the tops of chimneys black because soot would constantly be pouring out of it, and they would parge it underneath with white plaster, and so that's really where that comes from. Whether that happens at the time or later, but it was not a signal for any one thing or another. Yeah.
So the first Massachusetts Constitution got rejected outright.
Yep.
And then John Adams writes it. Was there any more pushback, especially about that first clause there?
With the initial I see, with what he wrote.
When he slipped that in there,
Yeah.
basically from the Declaration of Independence,
Yeah.
but now it's in the Constitution to make it legal. Was there any objection? Were there people calling that out?
If they did, we don't have a written record that I've been able to find of it. Yeah, I do know that even when they talk about writing the United States Constitution, they had such a hard time drawing a line between what rights do we preserve and what rights do we get rid of. And that talk of slavery was such a strong one that they really did have to kind of allow in, or I should say strip away any strong language that would have prevented that, because that's how you get the southern states to come on board. So if you're going to create a semblance of a United States at the time, they needed to make some concessions there. But up here, I have to imagine there were some people, like the very, 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 very wealthy merchants people here, who were not liking that. But they apparently didn't have enough sway, or John Adams ignored them, or that's something I would love to hear more about, though, as I do more research on it.
All right, anything else?
Yes.
Bringing this forward to the EPA, not the EPA, that's the wrong word. What am I looking for? I have trouble with
ERA?
ERA, thank you.
Oh, yes.
That first woman who successfully sued, she sued under the Massachusetts Constitution,
Correct.
which didn't really include her. She was female.
Right.
Now,
Yes. Yeah.
how did that all end up so that we have one more state to go for the ERA?
So I'll touch upon the first thing first. When they say men, don't think of that as being exclusively male per se. They were sort of using that as a colloquial term, as sort of all-encompassing in a way.
Okay.
To your latter point, though, would you mind repeating that about how we got to?
Back then, men weren't men, as you said. Men were anybody, guys, like we use the word guys.
You're right. Yeah.
So when did it turn that men were only men and therefore women were not considered part of the 14th Amendment it's the 14th, right?
Yes.
Yes, the 14th Amendment that says that slaves could vote.
Yeah, that's the Victorian age. So that's like when you get into the 1800s, you're coming out of what led to the United States becoming the United States, which is the Age of Enlightenment. And that Age of Enlightenment brought around the ideas of like humanism and thinking about the conditions of people in general. It would take, of course, a long time for women to, get the vote and to be part of and counted. But we even have in the era of them writing the Constitution and such, John Adams. Oh my God, I'm blanking on his wife's name right now. Thank you, Abigail Adams. Thank you so much. Abigail Adams saying, don't forget the women. Like, don't forget that we are also a part of this society too. And that's really when we start to see in the 1800s the voices of women, the enslaved, getting a greater and greater part of the story, mainly because of things like newspapers and local organizations that are able to be formed. And so their voices start to become a little bit louder and start to gain a bit more traction. And it's through that kind of steamrolls in some ways against a huge force that's preventing it, I'll say, but slowly gets to a point where it just can't be ignored anymore. We're still in that right now. We're definitely still in that. We're definitely better than we were 50, 100 years ago, but we're not anywhere close to where we should be. To your point about having not ratified the ERA. I hope that answered that somewhat for you. That's a very good question, though. It's a very, very good one as far as longevity.
Okay, why don't I just let people know that our next meeting is March 17th, and that is Evacuation Day. And Dan Gagnon is going to come in here and tell us the real story of Evacuation Day. So let's have our refreshments, and if anybody else wants to leave a contribution to La Collaborativa, the bucket will be over there. So thank you very much.
Thank you.